Stella.
And Tarrant here, and this is Meeple University's How to Play Gugong.
We are going to teach you how to play Gugong and also a few tips along the way so you can get yourself ready for game nights. Therefore, you can just concentrate on your strategy, not the rules.
Now, let's learn how to play. In Gugong, players play the role of influential families in Ming Dynasty China, attempting to gain the most influence across 4 rounds of play. In the game, players will be exchanging gifts with officials on the board in order to take their actions. Players can gain their victory points in a variety of different ways, such as contributing to the building of the Great Wall, buying jade from the jade suppliers, or advancing up the Temple of Heavenly Purity. And players need to balance all of these out, but cannot ignore the Temple of Heavenly Purity, as any player who fails to reach the top of it by the end of the game automatically loses. Of the players who do reach the end of the temple track, whoever has scored the most victory points after 4 rounds wins the game. In this video, we'll be teaching from the deluxe edition of the game, so many of the components are upgraded from the base version. The game also comes with a solo mode, which we won't be going through in this video. I'm not going to go through the full setup of the game, but I will talk about the starting conditions of most of the components as we come to them. What I do want to talk about is a few of the key components in the game that are around your player board. Firstly, I'll point out the icons for victory points in the game. This red flower with 5 lobes represents victory points gained during the game, and the purple flower with the 10 petals represents victory points gained at the end of the game. One of your most important components in the game is your servants, as you'll need to spend servants on performing most of the actions that will be worth points during the game. In the entire game you will have 12 servants available. Although there may be a couple of extra ones which come with your game, make sure you treat those extra ones as spares and use only 12. Through the game, you will need to retain 2 separate piles of servants and make sure you keep them apart and don't confuse them. Servants on your player board are known as your servant pool, and these are the servants that you have available to spend on actions. Servants kept off your board and in this tray in the deluxe edition are known as your servant supply. These are not available and you have to gain them before you can spend them on actions. You also have one more powerful double servant that you can unlock at some point during the game, and we'll talk about that later on. The other set of important components is your cards. At any point in time, you'll have a hand of cards, which you can look at, but which is secret to other players. And you've got a space for a discard pile. And throughout each round, you'll be placing cards on the board, retrieving cards, and placing them into your discard pile. You must remember to keep your hand and your discard pile separate. Each card has a number ranging between 1 and 9, has an icon in the top right corner which represents where that card goes during setup, and then in the white field down the bottom, the card may or may not show the icon relating to an action. Underneath the number, you'll also see a coloured dot or icon which matches the action down the bottom of the card. Each of the 4 rounds of the game is played over 3 phases: morning, day, and night, although most of the action occurs during the day phase. The morning phase is all about setting up for the next round, and you actually skip this phase during round 1 because all of the relevant steps take place as part of setup. So I will come back to the morning phase later, but I will point out in advance 2 actions that occur during this phase. Firstly, players gain a number of servants from their servant supply into their servant pool based on the round, and the 3 destiny dice are rolled and then placed back on these spaces. These have numbers ranging from 1 to 9 in an even distribution. Play then moves to the day phase. On each turn in the day phase, a player exchanges 1 card from his or her hand with a card on the board, and then takes actions based on the card that was played and the location in which it was played. The card that is retrieved is placed face down in the player's discard pile. leaving the player with one fewer cards in hand. After the player has taken actions, play moves to the next player clockwise, who also exchanges one card in this manner, and so on around the table until all players have used up all of the cards from their hand. When a player exchanges a card in this manner, he or she will be aiming to take one or two actions. Firstly, the action printed on the card, in this part down the bottom, and then the action of the location in which the card was placed. Not all cards have an action printed on them, so when a player is playing a card with no action, he or she will only be aiming to take the action of that location. Both the card action and the location action are optional for the player to take, but if the player takes both, he or she must take the card action first and the location action second. However, there is an additional complexity. Whether or not you can freely take the actions depends on the card in which you play. If you play a card which is higher than the card you retrieve, then you may immediately take the actions of the card and location. However, if the card you play is equal to or lower than the card you retrieve, then you must pay an additional cost in order to take any of the actions. This cost is either to return 2 servants to your servant supply, or to take another card from your hand and play it straight into your discard pile, losing you 1 turn for this round. If you cannot or do not wish to pay one of these costs, then you simply exchange the card with the board and then take no action for this turn. It is not optional to exchange a card with one on the board as long as you have a card in your hand. The exception to this rule is that a number 1 card is treated as if it is higher than a number 9 card, but no others. So exchanging this 1 with this 9 would allow the player to take this card and location action for free. Now, before I go on and talk about what all of the different actions in the game are, I'll pause briefly to talk about some of the implications of this card play, because this really is the essence of this game. Naturally, the higher numbered cards are going to be easier to play for cheaper actions than the lower value cards. However, many of the high value cards have no card action on them, and so while you may be taking a free action, you'll only be taking one of them, instead of taking 2 actions by playing one of these cards and spending servants or another card. It may not sound like a lot to spend 2 servants on playing a low value card and taking the actions, but servants are tight, and particularly early in the game, it may have taken you 1 or 2 actions to gain those servants in the first place, so spending them on a single action may not be a good exchange. What we'll also see as we come to looking at the actions in the game is that most of the locations have a free action and an action which will cost you 1 or 2 servants to do, but which is more powerful. So if you're spending your servants on playing your cards, you don't have those servants to take the more powerful actions on the board. So what you will find is that a lot of your options for card play are going to be on a net basis balanced out. And so the key to the game is about getting the right actions done at the right times, rather than simply trying to focus on one of these areas. There are 2 other important considerations when you're playing your cards, and these relate specifically to the cards that end up in your discard pile. Your discard pile becomes your hand for the next round. So part of your strategy should rely on not necessarily choosing the actions which help you, but choosing the cards which will help you in the next round. Similarly, you can set yourself up for a very weak subsequent round if you do a bad job of retrieving cards that suit your strategy. Secondly, at the end of the round, any cards in your discard pile which match the numbers on the destiny dice will gain you extra servants, and whoever has the most will get some victory points. So you may be trying to retrieve cards which will match these dice. I'll talk more about how this works when we get to the night phase of the game. Next, we'll talk about the 7 actions on the main board, starting with the intrigue track. When a player plays a card into the intrigue track, he or she may either, for free, move 1 step up the intrigue track, and then, if it's still there, take the next first player marker, allowing the player to be first player in the next round, or the player may spend 1 servant in order to move 3 steps up the intrigue track, but will not get to take the next first player marker when taking this action. Whenever a player moves up or down the intrigue track and lands on another player, his or her marker goes on top, and that player is considered ahead on the track. The intrigue track has two purposes in the game. Firstly, it breaks all ties, and we'll see this as we go on through the rules. Secondly, players will be able to spend intrigue on these bonuses, which is triggered by the Great Wall action space, and so we'll come back and talk about that later. The second location is the Temple of Heavenly Purity. When a player takes an action at the Temple of Heavenly Purity, he or she may either move his or her envoy one space up the temple track for free, or may spend 2 servants in order to move 2 steps up the temple track and move 1 step up the intrigue track. Once a player reaches the top of the Temple of Heavenly Purity, he or she lays his or her envoy meeple down in the highest points paying space that remains. For the rest of the game, any time the player would move 1 step up this track, he or she instead gains 1 victory point. Players must remember that if they do not get to the top of this track by the end of the game, they will automatically lose. However, players should also know that these location actions are not the only way to get steps up this track. There are a few other bonuses which we'll see as we go through the rest of the rules. Players also shouldn't let the fear of losing the game drive them into taking too many actions at the temple early. Other than this little victory point bonus, there's no actual engine building advantage to moving up this track, and so spending too much time there early in the game may not pay off in the long run. The third action location is Jade, and when a player takes an action in the Jade space, he or she spends a number of servants equal to the Jade token that he or she is trying to buy, and then takes that Jade token into his or her supply. Jade also has no engine building value, but is worth end of game victory points, and the amount of victory points escalates based on the amount of Jade the player has accumulated. The price of Jade in servants will escalate as the game goes on, and these Jade here will never be replenished. There are some other ways to acquire Jade at other locations, which we'll go into later, and do note that anytime Jade is gathered from one of these other locations, it comes from this bigger main supply. The fourth location is the Great Wall, where players may commit servants into assisting with the building of the Great Wall of China. At this location, the player has 2 options. Either place 1 servant on the wall in the leftmost available space, or spend 1 servant to place 2 other servants into the leftmost available spaces on the wall, giving a net servant cost of 3. After a player's placement is complete, if the row of servants meets or exceeds the number corresponding to your player count, this triggers Great Wall scoring. Note that we're using the 4 and 5 player side of the board. The 1, 2 and 3 player ones are on the opposite side of the board. Determine which player has the most servants on the wall, with any ties broken by the intrigue track. So in this case it's red. That player gains 3 victory points and moves 1 step up the Temple of Heavenly Purity track. Then retrieves all of his or her servants, putting them back in the supply, and shifting these servants over to the left. Then, all players who have at least 1 servant on the wall, including the player who just scored for having the most, may spend intrigue once to get one of these benefits. The player may spend 1 intrigue to get 1 servant, 3 intrigue for 2 servants, 5 intrigue to take any one of the destiny dice and set it to a side of his or her choosing, or 7 intrigue for 1 Jade. Players move their marker down the intrigue track to represent their purchase, and players make these purchases in reverse intrigue order. The 5th location is the decrees, and when taking an action here, a player may commit a servant to one of the degrees to get an ongoing benefit in the game. In setup, you'll choose 2 level 1 decrees, 2 level 2 decrees, and 2 level 3 decrees from a pool of 5 of each type. The level 1 decrees will give you a bonus that you can take during every morning phase. The level 2 decrees will make one of the other actions on the board more powerful or cheaper, and the level 3 decrees will give you an end of game victory point bonus. Each of the level 1 and 2 decrees will also give you an immediate score of victory points which you claim as soon as you place a servant onto that decree. To take this action, you must spend a number of servants, equal to the number in the bottom corner of the decree that you're placing, plus 1 servant for each servant already on that decree. So to place on this bottom decree here would cost 2 servants, which are returned to your supply. You then take a third servant and place it onto that decree. This means that these decrees will get very expensive as more players take them. This one already would cost you 4 servants plus a 5th to place onto the decree. A single player cannot have more than 1 servant on the same decree. You can find a full description of what all of the decree tiles do on the second last page of your rulebook. The 6th location is travel. At travel, a player may either take a single travel action for free, or spend 2 servants to take 2 travel actions. To take a single travel action, a player moves his or her travel token to a location, and then picks up and resolves the travel tile. The movement part of a travel action allows a player to move along these white dotted lines to the next travel token that can be reached, skipping over any spaces which are lacking their travel tokens. So from this location, the red player could move around to here, could move all the way down to here, or could simply move to the adjacent tile. These tiles will ultimately be refilled at the start of each round as part of the morning phase. When you take a travel token, in most cases you will activate its effect immediately and then flip the tile face down and place it into one of these 6 notches at the top of your player board. There are also some travel tiles which are not resolved immediately, and you place these ones face up next to your player board and then only place it into the slot once you've chosen to activate it. These ones are more advanced, and the rulebook doesn't recommend using these in your first game of Gugong. During the game, you'll build up a collection of travel tokens in these slots, and at any point as a free action you may spend travel tokens to gain these 3 benefits. Spend 2 tokens to gain 1 servant, spend 4 tokens to gain 2 victory points, or spend 6 to gain a jade. Note that this travel token counts as 2 travel tokens when you're taking these exchanges, but has no other effect. If all 6 of these slots are filled, then you must make an exchange before you can take another travel token from the board. The back page of the rulebook depicts all of the travel tokens in the game and explains how they work, including the advanced ones which you should leave out of your first playing of the game. The final location on the board is the Grand Canal, and on the 4 or 5 player side of the board there are 2 canals. On the 1 to 3 player side there is 1 canal. I'm going to explain this location in reverse. Ultimately what you're doing here is trying to gain access to these 3 benefits. Your double servant, extra cards which will give you an extra turn in each round, or straight victory points. In order to achieve those, what you ultimately need is to have one of your ships with 3 servants on it at a harbour which matches the benefit that you want. And so the actions you take here are leading towards these objectives. When taking actions at the canal location, the player has 2 options. Either make 1 servant placement and then move 1 ship, or spend 1 servant to make 2 servant placements, but not move the ship. Note that when a player takes the first option, both halves of that action are optional, but the player must take them in that order if he or she wishes to take both. A servant placement can be done in one of 2 ways. A player may either take a servant and place it onto any one of his or her existing ships on the harbour, or may take a new ship from his or her supply, place the servant onto it, and then automatically place that ship into the leftmost available space in one of the harbours. So in this case, it could go here or here. To take a ship movement action, a player chooses one of his or her ships and moves it to the next available harbour. So in this case, it would be 1 slot. In this one, the player would skip over this harbour because it's occupied and move straight to here. Note also that all of the ships will automatically move 1 space as part of the night phase, but we'll come back to that shortly. At any point after a placement or a movement, if you are in a situation where you have a ship with 3 servants on it in a harbour where you want that benefit, you can immediately claim that benefit. To do this, take one servant from that ship and place it into the notch corresponding to that benefit. If there's no space left, you cannot claim that reward anymore. Then take the other servants from the ship and return them to your supply, as well as returning to the ship to your supply. Then immediately claim the benefit. When you take this benefit, you immediately score 4 victory points. When you take this benefit, you draw a new gift card at random from the set of cards with this icon which was set aside at the start of the game. This goes straight into your hand, ready to be used in this round, and will give you 1 extra turn in this round and all subsequent rounds. If you take this benefit, take your double servant from your supply and place it straight into your pool for immediate use. Your double servant is an extremely valuable asset. You can spend it as if it is 2 servants, but then you may gain it back as if it is 1 servant. Additionally, when you place servants onto ships or onto the Great Wall, a direction to place 1 servant will allow you to place the double, which then counts as 2 on that ship. The only thing you can't do is place a double servant into one of these notches to gain the benefit twice. After all players have run out of cards in their hand, play proceeds to the night phase, which occurs in 2 steps. Firstly, retrieve the destiny dice. All players then look through their discard pile and determine how many matches with cards they have with those dice. In this case, the player has 5. 2 matches on this 3, 2 matches on this 3, and 1 match on that 8. Players gain 1 servant for each match that they make. And then the player that has the most matches, with the intrigue track counting as the tiebreaker, gets 3 victory points and gets to move 1 step up the Temple of Heavenly Purity. Then, all ships in the canal are moved 1 space down the canal. If there are any ships in the final space which have not yet claimed the benefit, that ship is lost at sea, and it and its servants are returned to the player's supply. After this movement, if any player has 3 servants on a ship in a harbour that they wish to claim, they may claim that benefit now. After the night phase is over, if the game isn't finished, proceed to the next round and the morning phase, where these 5 steps will occur. Firstly, the player who gained the next first player token in the previous round is given the first player token. The next first player token is put back onto the board. Then refill any spaces on the travel track which contain neither a token nor a player. Then re-roll the destiny dice. This will give you new destiny numbers to target in the subsequent round. Any players who have servants on a level 1 decree will take the benefits shown on that decree during the morning phase. Finally, advance the round marker to the next round, and all players gain the number of servants shown in this box, which is 4 in all rounds except for round 1. These servants are taken from the player's supply and put into the player's servant pool. After the 4th night phase is complete, the game is over and proceed to endgame scoring, which takes place in these 4 steps. Firstly, you'll do 1 more scoring on the Great Wall, even if the wall is not filled to your player count. Figure out who has the most servants on the wall, and that player will gain 3 victory points and move 1 step up the Temple of Heavenly Purity. Note, however, that in this final scoring you do not do intrigue trades. So any players who are holding up intrigue to exchange for jade at the end of the game need to do that on a Great Wall scoring which is triggered during the final day phase, not in this end of game phase. Then, players add points for any level 3 decrees where they have their servants, and players add points for how quickly they reach the top of the Temple of Heavenly Purity track. Remember that any players who have not reached the top by this time automatically lose the game. Finally, players score points for any jade they've collected during the game based on this table. 5 jade is 15 points, and any jade beyond that is worth 2 points each. The player with the highest score wins, And in the event of a tie, the player who is furthest up the intrigue track wins the game.
Well, we hope that you enjoyed the video and we hope that you enjoy playing.
If you'd like to see the game in action, we've put together a 1-round playthrough, which you can access by clicking on the link in the description below.
And also, we'd like to hear from you. Whether you have questions, comments, feedback, or just want to say hi, please write in the comment section below.
And finally, please do like our video, and if you'd like to hear more from Meeple University and be the first to see what's coming up from us, you can click on the Meeple in the corner to subscribe to our channel right now.